So Artur Beterbiev gets the win over Dmitry Bivol via points, although if you look at the circumstances surrounding that, that's caused quite a bit of controversy online.